It is shortly after 2 in the morning on May 15, 1918, in the darkness of the Argonne Forest. A 26-year-old railroad porter from Albany, New York, stands alone at a forward observation post. His rifle is empty. His grenades are gone. His comrade lies wounded at his feet, being dragged into the darkness by German soldiers. Henry Johnson is 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighs 130 pounds. Around him, at least a dozen enemy soldiers close in for the kill. He reaches for the only weapon he has left, a bolo knife with a 10-inch blade, a brush-clearing tool, and he refuses to surrender. 6 months earlier, the United States had been a nation at war for less than a year. On April 6, 1917, Congress had declared war on Imperial Germany, and President Woodrow Wilson had promised to make the world safe for democracy. It was a stirring phrase. It echoed through recruitment offices and newspaper editorials and the halls of government. Yet for millions of Black Americans living under Jim Crow laws denied the right to vote, subjected to segregation and violence and systemic oppression, the promise rang hollow. They lived in a nation that spoke of democracy abroad while denying it at home. The question facing Black leaders was profound and uncomfortable. Why should African Americans sacrifice themselves for a country that would not grant them full citizenship? Some argued that Black men had no business dying for a nation that lynched them. Others, like the scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, took a different view. In his famous editorial, Du Bois urged Black Americans to close ranks with their white fellow citizens while the war lasted, to forget their special grievances and fight shoulder to shoulder for democracy. The hope was that loyalty in war would lead to equality and peace. Prove your patriotism on the battlefield, the argument went, and America would have no choice but to recognize your humanity. 380,000 African Americans would answer that call during the First World War. 200,000 were sent overseas. Most would be relegated to labor and support roles, digging latrines and unloading ships and building roads. They would not be permitted to fight, but approximately 42,000 would see combat. And among them, one regiment would distinguish itself beyond all others. The Harlem Hellfighters began not as legends, but as an idea that took years to realize. On June 2, 1913, after years of advocacy from the Black community in New York City, the state legislature finally authorized the creation of an African American National Guard regiment. It would be the first of its kind in New York. Governor Charles Whitman appointed Colonel William Hayward, a white lawyer from Nebraska and a member of the Union League Club, to organize and command the new unit. Hayward was an ambitious and energetic officer who understood that building this regiment would require more than military discipline. It would require political skill, social connections, and a willingness to fight not only the Germans, but also the entrenched racism of the American military establishment. The regiment recruited from the streets of Harlem, porters and doormen, mailmen and laborers, elevator operators and hotel workers. Men who had been denied opportunities in civilian life now signed up for a chance to prove themselves as soldiers. Among Hayward's most important recruits was James Reese Europe, the famous band leader who had performed at Carnegie Hall and recorded for Victor Records. Europe enlisted as a lieutenant and was tasked with creating a regimental band that would be the finest in the Army. He recruited the best Black musicians he could find, including 16 Puerto Rican players from San Juan, to fill out his reed section. The band would later introduce jazz to European audiences and change the course of musical history. But that was still in the future. Among the thousands of men who enlisted in the summer of 1917 was a young porter from Albany named William Henry Johnson. He preferred to go by his middle name. Henry Johnson was not an imposing figure. He stood 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 130 pounds. He had worked as a chauffeur, a soda mixer, a coal yard laborer, and most recently as a red-cap porter at Albany's Union Station, carrying luggage for travelers. He was married to a woman named Edna and had children at home. He was 25 years old when he raised his right hand and swore the oath. Colonel Hayward would later describe him as a good soldier and a good boy of fine morale and upright character. There was nothing in his background to suggest that he would become one of the most celebrated warriors of the First World War. The regiment trained first at Camp Whitman in Poughkeepsie, New York, then transferred to Camp Wadsworth in Spartanburg, South Carolina. It was there that the men of the 15th New York learned what their country truly thought of them. The local population greeted them with open hostility. White soldiers stationed nearby made clear their refusal to serve alongside black troops. Harassment and racial abuse became daily occurrences. The tension grew so severe that Colonel Hayward feared violence. He requested that the regiment be transferred elsewhere before blood was spilled. His request was granted only because the Army wanted to avoid a scandal, not because it cared about the welfare of his men. In December of 1917, the regiment prepared to ship out for France. New York's other National Guard units were departing as well, bound for Europe as part of the 42nd Division, which had been assembled from units across the country and nicknamed the Rainbow Division. A grand farewell parade was organized to see the troops off, but when Colonel Hayward requested that his regiment be allowed to participate, he was refused. The reason given was blunt and cruel. Black is not a color in the rainbow. The 15th New York sailed for France without fanfare. They arrived in January of 1918, among the first American regiments to reach European soil. Yet, they were not sent to the front. They were not given rifles and pointed toward the enemy. Instead, they were handed shovels. The American Expeditionary Forces under General John J. Pershing had no intention of allowing black soldiers to fight alongside white troops. The men of the 15th New York were assigned to labor details. They unloaded ships at the docks of Brest. They dug latrines. They built roads. They performed the menial work that the Army considered appropriate for men of their race. Week after week, they waited for a chance to prove themselves in combat. Week after week, that chance was denied. On March 1, 1918, the regiment was redesignated as the 369th Infantry Regiment, assigned to the 93rd Division, but the reorganization changed nothing. The Army still refused to deploy black soldiers in combat roles. General Pershing faced a dilemma. He wanted to keep American forces unified and autonomous. He did not want his divisions broken up and scattered among the French and British, but he also had no intention of integrating his army. The 369th represented a problem he did not want to solve. The French army offered a solution. After nearly 4 years of devastating warfare, French forces were exhausted and depleted. They desperately needed reinforcements. And unlike the Americans, the French had long experience fighting alongside black soldiers from their colonies in Africa and the Caribbean. They did not share American prejudices about what black men could or could not do in battle. On April 8, 1918, General Pershing assigned the 369th Infantry Regiment to the French 16th Division, later the 161st Division. The regiment was detached from American command entirely. Colonel Hayward understood exactly what had happened. He wrote to a friend with bitter clarity. Our great American general simply put the black orphan in a basket, set it on the doorstep of the French, pulled the bell, and went away. The French welcomed them. The men of the 369th turned in their American rifles and equipment. They were issued French Adrian helmets, Berthier rifles, and French uniforms. They were taught enough French to understand basic commands. For 3 weeks, they trained alongside French soldiers in French tactics. The French instructors were impressed by their eagerness and their aptitude for the brutal work of trench warfare. One American soldier noted that his comrades, who had played baseball, could throw grenades farther than the French, which amused their new allies. The black soldiers who had been rejected by their own army had found a home with another. In mid-April of 1918, the 369th Infantry Regiment moved forward to the front lines in the Champagne region of northeastern France. They took up positions at the western edge of the Argonne Forest, a dense and tangled woodland that would soon become one of the most fought-over pieces of terrain on the Western Front. For the first time, Henry Johnson and his fellow soldiers were in the war. The front lines were nothing like the men had imagined. For months, they had trained and waited and dreamed of combat, of charging across open fields with bayonets fixed, of glory and heroism and the chance to prove what black soldiers could do. The reality was mud and boredom. and the constant presence of death. The trenches of the Western Front were not battlefields in any traditional sense. They were underground cities, miles of zigzagging ditches carved into the earth, reinforced with timber and sandbags, connected by communication trenches that ran back towards supply depots and field hospitals. Men lived in these ditches for weeks at a time, sleeping in dugouts, eating cold rations, watching rats grow fat on the remains of the dead. The 369th Infantry Regiment entered the front-line trenches in the Champagne region on April 15, 1918. They were integrated with the French 161st Division under the overall command of the French Fourth Army. Their sector lay at the western edge of the Argonne Forest, a dense woodland of oak and beech that stretched for miles across the rolling hills of northeastern France. The forest had already seen heavy fighting in the early years of the war, and it bore the scars of that violence. Shattered trees stood like skeletons against the gray sky. Shell craters pockmarked the earth. The smell of decay hung in the air, mingling with the sharper odors of cordite and chlorine. For the men of the 369th, arrival at the front brought a profound sense of relief. They had escaped the humiliation of labor duty. They had finally been given the chance to fight. The French soldiers who greeted them were welcoming and professional. They showed the Americans how to navigate the trench system, how to keep their heads below the parapet, how to read the sounds of incoming artillery and know when to take cover. The French had been at war for nearly 4 years. They had learned lessons in blood that the Americans were only beginning to understand. The first weeks at the front were relatively quiet. The regiment conducted patrols into no man's land, the blasted wasteland that separated the Allied trenches from the German lines. They exchanged sporadic artillery fire with the enemy. They rotated through duty shifts, spending hours on watch, staring into the darkness, waiting for something to happen. The tension was constant and exhausting. Snipers took shots at any head that rose above the trench line. Artillery barrages could come at any hour, without warning, turning the world into fire and thunder. Poison gas was an ever-present threat, and the men learned to keep their masks close at hand. But for the moment, there were no major assaults, no massed infantry attacks. The war had settled into a deadly routine. The French system of defense relied heavily on forward observation posts. These were small, isolated positions located ahead of the main trench line, often near the barbed wire that marked the edge of no man's land. The purpose of these outposts was simple. They provided early warning of enemy activity. They allowed observers to watch for signs of an impending attack. And they served as a first line of defense against one of the most feared tactics of trench warfare: the raid. German trench raids had become increasingly common as the war dragged on. The stalemate on the Western Front meant that neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough, but information about the enemy was always valuable. Commanders needed to know which units were facing them, what their strength was, what their morale was like. The most reliable way to gather this intelligence was to capture prisoners. A single soldier, properly interrogated, could reveal the identity of his regiment, the disposition of nearby forces, the timing of planned operations. Documents found on prisoners or in captured dugouts could be even more valuable. And so both sides launched raids, small-scale attacks, designed not to seize territory, but to grab prisoners and spread terror. A typical German raiding party consisted of 10 to 50 elite soldiers, carefully selected for their courage and skill in close-quarters combat. They were specialists in the most brutal form of warfare. Their weapons were chosen for the confined spaces of the trenches: grenades to clear dugouts, pistols for close-range killing, knives and clubs for silent work. The raiders would approach under cover of darkness, crawling through no man's land until they reached the enemy wire. Specialists with wire cutters would open gaps in the entanglements. Then the assault party would slip through, overwhelm the sentries, grab their prisoners and withdraw before reinforcements could arrive. A successful raid could be over in minutes. The defenders would be left with dead comrades and the knowledge that the enemy could reach them whenever they chose. In the spring of 1918, German commanders were particularly eager for intelligence about the American forces arriving in France. The entry of the United States into the war had shifted the strategic balance. Germany needed to win before American manpower could tip the scales decisively against them. They launched their Great Spring Offensive in March, hoping to break the Allied lines before it was too late. And they sent raiding parties against American positions, probing for weaknesses, capturing prisoners, testing the quality of these new enemies. Among the questions they sought to answer was one that revealed much about the prejudices of the age. Could Black American soldiers fight? Or would they break under pressure, as some white officers predicted? On the evening of May 14, 1918, Private Henry Johnson and Private Needham Roberts were assigned to observation post duty. Roberts was just 17 years old, a boy from Trenton, New Jersey, who had enlisted by lying about his age. He was young and eager and had never seen combat. Johnson, at 26, was the older and more experienced of the two, though neither man had yet faced the enemy at close quarters. Their shift ran from midnight to 4 in the morning, the darkest and loneliest hours of the night. Their position was a forward observation post near a bridge over the Aisne River at a place called Bois d'Auzy. They were part of a 5-man observation crew, but on this night, only the 2 of them manned the post. The night began with violence. German snipers fired at Johnson and Roberts shortly after they took up their positions. The shots cracked through the darkness, and the 2 men pressed themselves flat against the earth. They had been spotted. They were being watched. The snipers did not hit them, but the message was clear. The enemy knew they were there. Johnson and Roberts did not panic. They did what soldiers do. They prepared for the worst. Johnson found a box of grenades and lined them up within easy reach. If the Germans came, they would be ready. Then the firing stopped. The forest grew quiet. The hours passed slowly, measured by the distant rumble of artillery and the whisper of wind through the shattered trees. 1 o'clock came and went. The 2 men watched and waited in the darkness. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning on May 15th, the silence broke. Roberts heard it first. A small sound, metallic, rhythmic, the distinctive snick of wire cutters biting through steel. He knew instantly what it meant. German raiders were cutting through the barbed wire. The attack was coming. Johnson did not hesitate. He grabbed a grenade and hurled it toward the perimeter fence, toward the sound of the wire cutters. The explosion lit the night for a brief, blinding moment. Then, the Germans returned fire. Grenades arced through the darkness and detonated around the observation post. Rifle shots cracked from multiple directions. Johnson shouted for Roberts to run, to get back to the main line, and warned the French that a raid was underway. Roberts ran, but he did not get far. The fire was too heavy. He turned and came back, unwilling to abandon his comrade. By then, the Germans were through the wire. At least a dozen soldiers, perhaps as many as 24, were advancing on the position. They came with grenades and rifles and bayonets. They came for prisoners. And Henry Johnson stood in their way. The grenades came first. Johnson threw everything he had toward the advancing Germans, one after another, the explosions tearing through the night. The enemy answered in kind. German grenades arced through the darkness and detonated around the observation post, filling the air with shrapnel and fire. Roberts was hit almost immediately. Fragments sliced into his arms, his legs, his head. He went down hard, blood streaming from multiple wounds. But he was not dead. He crawled toward Johnson and began handing him grenades, feeding the only defense they had. Johnson kept throwing. The box was emptying fast. Each explosion bought seconds, nothing more. The Germans kept coming. There were too many of them. At least a dozen soldiers, possibly twice that number, were pushing through the wire and advancing on the position. These were not ordinary infantrymen. They were specialists in the brutal art of the trench raid, handpicked for their skill in close-quarters killing. They had grenades of their own, and rifles, and bayonets, and the cold certainty that 2 men could not stop them. The grenade box was empty. Johnson grabbed his rifle, the French Berthier that the army had issued when they joined the French command. It was a bolt-action weapon, reliable but slow, holding only 3 rounds in its magazine. Johnson raised the rifle and fired. The first shot struck a German soldier and sent him sprawling. Johnson worked the bolt and fired again. Another hit. He fired a third time. Then the rifle jammed. Where the magazine was empty, in the chaos of battle it hardly mattered which. The weapon was useless. The Germans were on top of them now, no more than a few yards away, close enough to see their faces in the flickering light of explosions. Roberts lay bleeding on the ground, too wounded to fight, too stubborn to die. Johnson stood over him with an empty rifle in his hands. He had no time to reload, no time to think. He did what instinct demanded. He swung the rifle like a club. The stock smashed into a German helmet with a crack that echoed through the night. Johnson swung again, driving the butt of the rifle into flesh and bone. For a few desperate seconds, he held them back through sheer ferocity, a small man with a broken weapon against a trained assault squad. Then, a German soldier got inside his reach. A blow to the head sent Johnson sprawling to the ground. The rifle was torn from his hands. He lay in the mud, dazed, his vision swimming, blood running down his face. When his eyes focused, he saw something that changed everything. 2 German soldiers had grabbed Needham Roberts by the arms and were dragging him away. They were taking him prisoner. This was what the raid was for. This was the objective. Capture an American soldier, drag him back to German lines, interrogate him for intelligence. Roberts was wounded and helpless. He could not resist. In moments, he would be gone. Henry Johnson had a choice. He could stay down. He could let the Germans take his comrade and slip away in the confusion. No one would blame him. He was wounded, disarmed, outnumbered more than 10 to 1. Survival was the rational option. He did not choose survival. Johnson reached for his belt and drew the only weapon he had left: the United States Army Model 1910 bolo knife. It was not a combat weapon. It was a tool issued to soldiers for clearing brush and cutting fields of fire, a heavy blade with a 10-inch edge designed for hacking through vegetation. No one had ever intended it for killing men, but Henry Johnson had nothing else. He rose from the mud and charged. The Germans carrying Roberts did not see him coming until he was on them. Johnson drove the bolo knife into the first man with all the strength he had. The blade went through. The German screamed and fell. Johnson ripped the knife free and turned on the second man. He slashed and stabbed, the heavy blade catching the dim light as it rose and fell. The German dropped Roberts and tried to defend himself. Johnson did not give him the chance. The other raiders turned toward the sound of the fighting. They saw a small man covered in blood, holding a knife, standing over their fallen comrades. They rushed him. Johnson did not retreat. He waded into them, swinging the bolo knife in vicious arcs, hacking at arms and faces and throats. One German climbed onto his back, trying to drag him down. Johnson twisted and drove the knife backward, burying it in the man's body. Another German raised a rifle. Johnson was faster. The knife found its mark. He was shot in the arm. He kept fighting. He was stabbed with a bayonet. He kept fighting. He was hit so many times that later, when the doctors counted, they would find 21 separate wounds on his body. He kept fighting. Each slash meant something, believe me, Johnson said later. There was no bravado in the words. There was only the memory of what he had done to stay alive. The sounds of the struggle carried through the night. At the main trench line, French and American soldiers heard the explosions and the screaming. Reinforcements began to move forward. Flares arced into the sky, bathing the forest in harsh white light. The Germans saw the illumination and understood what it meant. Help was coming. The raid was failing. They had not captured their prisoners. They had lost men. And the small American with the knife was still on his feet, still swinging, still killing. The raiders broke. They turned and fled back toward their own lines, dragging their wounded with them, leaving their dead behind. Johnson pursued them for a few steps, slashing at the retreating figures, then stopped. His legs would no longer carry him. He stumbled back to where Roberts lay and grabbed his wounded comrade by the collar. He began dragging him toward the Allied lines. He made it only a few yards before his strength gave out entirely. When the reinforcements arrived, they found Henry Johnson collapsed on the ground beside Needham Roberts. Both men were alive. Both were soaked in blood, their own and their enemies. Around them lay the evidence of what had happened. 4 German soldiers were dead. Estimates of the wounded ranged from 10 to 20 more. German weapons and equipment littered the observation post, abandoned in the retreat. The raiders had come for prisoners and intelligence. They had found neither. They had found Henry Johnson. Dawn broke over the Argonne Forest. The light revealed the full scope of the carnage. The mud was churned and bloody. Shell craters from the grenades scarred the earth. And in the middle of it all, a bolo knife lay where it had fallen from Johnson's hand, the blade dark with what it had done. The German High Command had wanted to know whether black American soldiers could fight. The men of the raiding party had learned the answer. The ones who survived would carry that knowledge back to their lines. The ones who did not survive would never carry anything again. Henry Johnson had sustained 21 wounds. He had killed 4 men and wounded perhaps 20 more. He had saved his comrade from capture. He had held the line alone, with nothing but a knife and a refusal to surrender. He was 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 130 pounds. And he had just become the most celebrated American soldier of the First World War. The French would call him a magnificent example of courage and energy. The Germans would call him Schwarzer Tod, Black Death. His own countrymen would call him a hero. For a little while, the French did not wait. On May 16, 1918, one day after the battle, the French command issued orders recognizing the extraordinary actions of Private Henry Johnson and Private Needham Roberts. The official citation stated that Johnson had given a magnificent example of courage and energy. Both men were awarded the Croix de Guerre avec Palme, the War Cross with Palm, France's highest decoration for battlefield valor. The gold palm affixed to the ribbon signified that their heroism had been exceptional, even by the standards of a war that had produced countless acts of bravery. Johnson and Roberts were the first American privates to receive this honor. They would not be the last from the 369th Infantry Regiment, but they were the first, and their example set the standard for all who followed. The ceremony was held with full military honors. The entire French force in the Champagne sector lined up to watch as the medals were pinned to the chests of the 2 wounded Americans. French officers who had spent 4 years fighting the Germans recognized what Johnson had done. A single man, armed with nothing but a knife, had defeated a raiding party of elite German soldiers. He had killed 4 and wounded as many as 20 more. He had prevented the capture of his comrade and denied the enemy the intelligence they sought. This was not merely courage. This was something that bordered on the impossible. From that day forward, Henry Johnson was known by a new name. The Germans called him Schwarzer Tod, Black Death. It was a title earned in blood, and it would follow him for the rest of his life. The 369th Infantry Regiment continued to fight through the summer and fall of 1918. They served at Minecourt, in the Champagne-Marne Defensive, and during the Aisne-Marne Offensive. In September, they participated in the Great Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the largest American military operation of the war. On September 29th, the regiment attacked the village of Seychaux. They took it, but the cost was devastating. 1/3 of the regiment became casualties in a single day. By the time the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, the 369th had spent 191 days on the front lines, longer than any other American regiment of its size. They had suffered more than 1,400 casualties. They had never lost a foot of ground. They had never had a man taken prisoner. The French awarded the Croix de Guerre to 170 individual members of the regiment and presented a unit citation to the regiment as a whole. On February 17, 1919, the 369th Infantry Regiment came home to New York. The men who had been denied a place in the farewell parade now received a homecoming that the city would never forget. They marched up Fifth Avenue from downtown Manhattan all the way to Harlem, and the crowds that lined the route numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Some estimates placed the total at more than 1 million people. They cheered and waved flags and threw flowers at the passing soldiers. James Reese Europe's band played jazz as they marched, the syncopated rhythms echoing off the buildings, and the sound was like nothing New York had ever heard. At the head of the procession, riding in an open-top Cadillac, was Sergeant Henry Johnson. He had been promoted after the battle. He could not march because of his wound, so he stood in the car and waved to the crowd, holding a bouquet of red lilies. The people shouted his name. They shouted his nickname. "Oh, you Black Death," they cried, and Johnson smiled and waved. The New York World reported that the Negro troops practically owned the city. Former President Theodore Roosevelt declared that Henry Johnson was one of the 5 bravest Americans to serve in the entire war. The Army used Johnson's image on recruitment posters and victory war stamps. "Henry Johnson licked a dozen Germans," the posters read. "How many stamps have you licked?" For a brief, shining moment, Henry Johnson was the most famous soldier in America. The Army sent him on a speaking tour. He traveled from city to city, appearing at rallies and bond drives, telling his story to audiences who had read about his exploits in the newspapers. The purpose of the tour was propaganda. Johnson was presented as proof that the races had come together in harmony to defeat the German enemy, that black and white Americans had fought side by side for democracy. It was a comfortable story. It was not true. Johnson knew it was not true. He had lived the reality. He had seen white soldiers refuse to serve alongside black troops. He had been denied the farewell parade. He had been relegated to labor duty while white regiments trained for combat. He had been handed off to the French because his own army did not want him. The comfortable story was a lie, and Johnson was being asked to tell it over and over again, to smile and wave and pretend that everything was fine. In March of 1919, Johnson reached St. Louis. A celebration for black soldiers had been organized, sponsored by the War Department. Speaker after speaker took the stage and praised the harmony of the races in wartime, the way that black and white Americans had come together for a common cause. Then, it was Johnson's turn. He stood before the audience and told the truth. White soldiers had refused to fight alongside black soldiers, he said. Black troops had not been properly recognized for their contributions. They had been deliberately placed in the most dangerous positions. White people would never have been asked to do what they did. The war had not been a story of racial harmony. It had been a story of racism and injustice, and the men of the 369th had succeeded despite their own country, not because of it. Some in the audience applauded his honesty. Others were furious. The War Department was not pleased. Johnson left St. Louis that same day and returned to Albany. He was never invited to speak again. The Army reportedly requested that he no longer wear his uniform in public. The hero had become inconvenient. The years that followed were cruel. Johnson's 21 wounds had never fully healed. His leg was shattered, held together by a metal plate. He could not return to his old job as a porter. He could not stand for long periods. He could not carry luggage. The Army had not mentioned his injuries in his discharge records. He was denied a disability pension. Some called it a paperwork error. Others suspected it was deliberate punishment for what he had said in St. Louis. Unable to work, unable to provide for his family, Johnson began to drink. The alcohol dulled the pain in his body and the bitterness in his heart. His wife Edna left him and took the children. He drifted from job to job, from city to city, a forgotten man in a country that had cheered his name only a few years before. He likely suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, though no one used that term in 1919. He had seen things in the Argonne Forest that no man should see. He had done things that no man should have to do, and he was given no help, no support, no recognition from the nation he had served. On July 1st, 1929, Henry Johnson died in Washington, D.C. The cause was myocarditis, an inflammation of the heart. He was 32 years old. He was penniless. He was alone. For decades afterward, it was believed that he had been buried in a pauper's grave in Albany, forgotten and unmourned. It was not until 2001 that researchers discovered the truth. Henry Johnson had been buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. Someone had arranged for him to be laid to rest among the nation's honored dead. But no one had told his family. No one had told the public. The hero of the Argonne Forest had been given a hero's burial, and then he had been forgotten anyway. The campaign for recognition began slowly and lasted decades. In 1991, a monument was erected in Albany's Washington Park. In 1996, President Bill Clinton posthumously awarded Johnson the Purple Heart. In 2002, the Army awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross, its second highest decoration for valor. Advocates continued to push for the Medal of Honor. Senator Chuck Schumer of New York led the effort. Researchers discovered a memo from General Pershing, written just days after the battle, that proved the chain of command had known of Johnson's heroism from the beginning. On June 2, 2015, President Barack Obama presented the Medal of Honor posthumously to Henry Johnson. 97 years had passed since the night in the Argonne Forest. There were no living blood relatives to receive the medal. Command Sergeant Major Louis Wilson of the New York National Guard accepted it on behalf of a man he had never known. "It is never too late to say thank you," Obama said. But for Henry Johnson, it was far too late. In 2021, Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the entire 369th Infantry Regiment. In 2023, Fort Polk, Louisiana, a base that had been named for a Confederate general, was renamed Fort Johnson in honor of the railroad porter from Albany who had fought off 24 Germans with a knife. Henry Johnson fought 2 wars. The first was against the Germans in a dark forest in France, and he won it in a single night with an empty rifle and a bolo knife and a refusal to die. The second was against his own country, against the racism that denied him recognition, denied him a pension, denied him the dignity he had earned in blood. That war took 97 years to win, and he was not alive to see it. France honored him in one day. America took nearly a century. He was given a parade and then forgotten. He was called one of the 5 bravest Americans and then left to die alone. The Medal of Honor came too late for Henry Johnson to hold. The base that bears his name cannot give him back the years he lost. He was 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 130 pounds. He saved his comrade. He held the line. And his country failed him anyway.